Good afternoon. This is Jody Gabel. If anybody's out there and tuned in, can you let me know you can hear me and see me? Okay, we're going to get started. I'm a lawyer. I've been in the landlord-tenant area practice for 26 years. I've been involved and interested, of course, in the tiny house movement for as long as it's been in existence. And I've been able to find a little niche. I'm only licensed to practice in Florida, so my advice can only be general advice for this global forum. I have to thank this format because the exposure and the exchange with people all across the world has been absolutely astounding. I'm thrilled. I'm just a little girl from Pennsylvania, and this is just an amazing experience for me. So we're going to go to my PowerPoint now, and let's do my talk, and then I'm happy to answer questions. I'll be able to leave a good amount of time for that. We're going to get to my PowerPoint here in 1 second. Yeah, there we go. This is called, ironically, 2020 Lawyer's Point of View. And I'm an attorney, like I said, in Sarasota, Florida. I've been here for 26 years. The primary impact of what I want to talk about today are just general things you can do to protect yourself in any type of contract that you're going to enter into, whether it's you're building a home, whether you're going to rent a site, you're going to travel the U.S. and you're going to do short-term leases, or you're just going to do overnight stays. There are certain things that you're going to want to keep in mind to protect yourself or watch out for, and those are the things that I'm going to just discuss generally for you this afternoon. The importance of a written contract, you can't say enough. Anyone who's lived anywhere or had any type of appliance knows that those written contracts can be your best friend or your worst enemy. So a contract is formed through a meeting of the minds. I want to do something and you're going to give me something. We put it in writing. You make me an offer and I agree to pay you for your services or for your rental of a site, and we agree on what the terms are. Without a written contract, it's subject to everyone's memory of what it was we actually agreed to. And it's amazing when two people talk and they leave the conversation, their impression is based on their perception of how everything went. So it's very easy to think that you agreed on certain terms that had nothing to do with the way the conversation ended. So that's why it's important to have your contract in writing and know exactly what the terms are. The biggest problems, and most people end up in litigation because their expectation of what is to happen and when it's supposed to happen is totally backwards from what the other person heard during the conversation. So when, especially in a home build, and I know you've heard a lot of contractors talk, you just heard a great presentation on home design. Those concepts are so specific, but as you're listening to those concepts as a first-time home builder, a new owner, your mind is off on what you're going to do with that house, and the specifics are being discussed, but you can't help but be excited about what you're listening to and what your plans are for what's going to happen with that home. The problem is your expectations don't match up with what was discussed as far as the timing issues for the build or the timing issues for materials or the costs. So having that in writing is critical and really a good idea, especially if you're a single person. Have somebody with you when you're talking about the really specific build aspects of the home. it's so easy to get caught up. It's just like going to a doctor's appointment, getting good news or bad news. You only remember every third word or the bad word or the good word, like you're pregnant or you're not. And you don't really remember much after that. Same thing happens when you're looking at home construction or you're looking at entering into a lease, in the resort of your dreams. Good idea to have someone with you. So you enter into a contract, and especially matching what you're doing with the home build, having completion dates with payment dates has been a recommended format for a long, long time. And all the builders that I know in the industry match up payments in that fashion. You don't put so much down and then only have a small pittance to pay at the end. Most of the work is performed up to a certain point, and then another payment is made so that it's a staged progress with you and your payments for throughout the contract. If you do have a change in a contract, or say it's a lease for renting a site, and you're going to add an additional person to your lease, always make sure it's in writing, so that there's absolutely no misunderstanding about what the change is, what the addition is, and everyone knows going forward that this additional person is authorized to be at your house, or that you're going to add this change order that's another $2,000, and when the payment is going to be due for that additional change. It's very easy, it's like when changes occur, they're usually for the positive, but they can also be for the negative. And your perception at that time is very critical, that you really understand what your obligation is. Because this is a personal relationship. Anywhere you live or anything you build to live in is one of the most decisions you'll ever make in your life. So you absolutely want to avoid unreasonable expectations and assumptions, so that that experience for you is going to remain positive, and that you can make decisions that are going to have positive impacts on your outcome and your ability to move forward with both the build and the lease. Like I said, leasing and site reservation agreements are critical. With COVID and with the current state of unemployment or people who have been laid off from their jobs, many more people are doing shorter RV trips. And when you are entering into even a short-term site reservation, and definitely if you're looking to enter into a lease of land for a change to a real true tiny house living experience, you really want to look at that lease very carefully. Even if you've lived and had leases in apartments or condominiums, when you change from an apartment, a condo, to leasing land from a landowner or a landlord, you want to make sure you understand completely what's included in that site rent. There can be extra charges that you assume are included in rent. Just because there's water hookup and sewer hookup and other types of services available does not mean that if you are paying, say, $250 a night, that water and sewer are included in those charges. Now, that's usually for long-term leases, but it also applies to short-term leasing situations as well. The critical factor for longer term, I would say like a week, anything from a week or longer for a site lease. Always know what the conditions are for cancellation of the lease. In Florida, and that's where I'm licensed to practice, most leases for short-term rentals can be canceled for no reason. You are basically renting that site at will, and if the landlord changes the decision to lease that spot to you, they have to give notice, but they don't have to have a reason. They can just say it's time for you to move on. We're going to use this spot for someone else, and you're going to be required to move down the road with appropriate notice. So those are things you really, really want to look at. Like I said, I've been in this aspect of housing, leasing for a long time, but I've reviewed a lot of lease situations for friends and potential clients who are going tiny and want to see if the conditions for their site lease are reasonable or if they appear to be a little overreaching. And the final issue for site reservations, a lot of places, if it's going to be a longer term reservation, they're going to require a deposit. And some of the deposits, I mean, it's not money you want to walk away from. So you want to find out what the requirements are for the return of that deposit. Nobody wants to walk away from money that is due to you. So if you stay in one particular place, always check those provisions in the lease or the site reservation agreement to make sure you're going to be able to get your money back when you decide you're going to end your stay. I know there have been other people who've talked about this. This is more for home builds, independent third-party inspections for home construction after the build or during the build, to document compliance with all the codes, all the building codes for the state you're in and for transport. These services cannot be, recommended enough. There are many of these services available, and they're going to provide you with your entree to be able to take your tiny house on the road and be mobile and be roadworthy. So these services are very important for that aspect of your tiny house build. Always check the reputation of the third-party inspectors and their independent evaluators. Just to make sure, just like with site lease reservation or with any other written document, just always check out what other people say about the performance of the inspector. Your ability to use your funds should be apportioned with people who do quality work, and you want to make sure that a certification service for your tiny house to make sure it's roadworthy is reputable and does good work for all the people who go, for that type of service. This is kind of a strange slide. Most attorneys don't provide alternatives to coming to an attorney, but this is what this slide is about. What I've seen in the past, I'd say 2 to 3 years, even before COVID, people tend to disagree more often and more vehemently than they ever have in the past 10 years. So, of course, you're going to, if you're in a build situation, if you're with a landlord conflict, make every attempt you can to resolve it, because the minute you go to a lawyer, it's going to astronomically increase your expenses. 2 alternatives exist. One is an online arbitration service that it sounds expensive. It's $400 starting. Most likely, I think they can be smaller. But if you're 2 people who just can't agree, and if you go to an attorney, it's going to cost each of you $2,500, this could be a reasonable alternative for you. You just write down what your dispute is from both sides. You send it into this an independent third party to review, and they come up with a decision. Their decision is supposed to be binding, because the whole point of this is kind of give your dispute to someone, get a resolution, and move on. The other alternative is a voluntary mediation service that is usually offered at most municipalities and local governments. It could be through an agency type situation, like a neighborhood watch. Usually they have a voluntary mediation service. This even works for site-built people, but definitely for people who are living in small, closer-knit communities or closer vicinity communities where disputes with your neighboring renter can get a little heated. So look for those on the internet, and you may be able to save yourself a lot of money and resolve a dispute without even having to say the word attorney. So that's a good cost savings mechanism for you. This is a big topic right now in our industry, the impact of COVID on the tiny house movement. there has been a huge push, and I know Zach Giffen gives this talk more eloquently than anybody else that I've heard. Municipalities have come to the realization that multifamily living is going to become a necessity just based on economics. Then you bring COVID to the forefront, and the CDC, through government directive, entered an eviction ban towards right around the middle of the year this year, because the concerns that if people were evicted due to the economic situation, they would have no alternative but to move in with other family members. And when you have multiple families living in one small area, of course, COVID exposure is going to increase, number of cases are going to increase, number of deaths could potentially increase. So the CDC entered a ban on evictions, and that ban continues through New Year's Eve this year. Municipalities already on board with the tiny house movement have been approving alternative dwelling units, kind of like the mini-me backyard unit. It used to be for mom and dad, so they could downsize, or grandma and grandpa, so they could downsize. Now those ADUs are looking like it could be for the adult children who may have lost their jobs or are working part-time and can't pay their rent and need a place to live. So these ADUs are becoming a much more common addition to municipalities. And some places, Florida has, within the last 3 or 4 months, approved ADUs in more counties than I can count. And I believe this is in advance of the eviction ban being lifted the beginning of 2021. With that type of addition of ADU approval comes an increased demand for not only production of tiny houses, ADUs, but there's also a critical draw on demand on lumber. And lumber manufacturing has become not an issue, but the housing industries have been lobbying Congress to support the lumber industries to keep their manufacturing able to meet demand. So for the individual who's looking to build a tiny house, the end of this year, beginning of next year, definitely middle of next year, really protect your contract. Make sure that you think about the demand that's going to be in place for this type of living situation. There are manufacturers of ADUs and tiny houses that go by other names. But even if you're working with the tiny house contractors that you're hearing talking today, they will be affected at some point by the huge demand for this type of product. So you want to make sure when you have your written contract that you know that demand's coming, and make sure that you have built-in specifications for completion dates, payment dates, and all the things that we've talked about so far. So that's kind of a strange addition that a lawyer wouldn't usually bring in, the Center for Disease Control in a talk about contracts, but it's really going to hit the demand for housing. So we're at the summary point already. Protect yourself by putting terms in your contracts that meet your expectations. They're reasonable, and you, your builder, your landlord, you both agree on what it is that those terms are. And if it's a payment situation, make sure you have the deadline specifically in place for what amount of payment is going to occur. If you have changes to your contracts, follow the same, same procedure. Put it in writing, change the dates, change the payment times. Make sure if you're going to be renting through a site agreement, long-term lease, short-term lease, that you read the terms. So many people are so anxious to get into the site, put your feet up and relax. Make sure you take that time to read what the terms are so that you understand what's expected of you as the tenant and what you're due also as the tenant. Third-party inspection services and certification, critical for people who want to be roadworthy and put their tiny houses on wheels, to make sure when you cross state lines, you're going to meet inspection standards. We're lucky we live in the United States of America. There's nobody at the state line who's running an inspection service, but there are DOT inspectors if they see anything when you're on the road and they find things to be a safety situation. Sometimes that can occur. An inspection could occur on the spur of the moment like that. Just as more informational than anything, there are online dispute resolution services available, and there are local voluntary mediation services that you can look up to avoid having to use a lawyer. These things sound a little far-fetched until you get into a dispute with someone, and then it becomes a nightmare and consumes your whole existence. So just remember those words. They may help you save some money in the future. And then finally, if you're entering into a contract for a home build, be sure to keep your eye on the terms of the contract, especially if you're going to enter into them after the beginning of the year. Those are the critical factors as I see them. Now I'm going to flip back and get out of the sharing screen and look and see if we have any questions. I thank all of you for listening to what I have to say, and I really thank the organization for asking me to talk. It's been a great experience for me. So we'll go back and see if we have any questions here. And I'm flipping back just to see. I see some comments that arbitration and mediation you thought was helpful. I thought that may have been a little overkill. Let's see. Yeah, Nancy Mock. It's called an alternative dwelling unit. It's a term that local governments use. It's kind of like the she shed, like you see on TV. It's a small unit, absolutely. Usually aesthetically has to match the house in front of it, but it's in the back. It can be placed in the backyard, and it is becoming more approved and a viable solution for multiple family living on one real estate property site, which is really saving a lot of families, because downsizing and multifamily living is becoming more important as time goes by. Okay, not seeing a whole lot of questions, but looks like people were finding the COVID information interesting, which is good. To me, that's kind of a far stretch. I did not really see that impacting housing as much as it did, but once the CDC moratorium went into effect, it became a critical issue. The one thing I can tell you is that the percentage of delinquencies, the percentage of people subject to eviction has been far smaller than what we anticipated. It's most of the property owners have experienced, I would say, less than 10% delinquencies, which means that 90% of the people who are paying rent in different housing markets have been able to make their payments. So from my vantage point, that's a very big positive, that maybe the eviction issue will not be a huge national crisis at the beginning of the year, but definitely the demand on the housing market will continue. So looking through the questions, not quite seeing anything that I need to answer at this point. So looks like we're probably going to finish up a little early. And I thank all of you for, okay. Lindsay is requesting the mic. And I don't know if I've done that or not.
Yes, Hi, Jody.
Hey.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. That education, I actually videotaped the COVID part and all that's going on and sent it off to Dan Fitzpatrick with the Tiny Home Industry Association. So I understand you're a lawyer in Florida. So for people to call you and get legal advice based on where they're at, that wouldn't necessarily work. That's why you were giving all those, different ideas of where
Yes, I wouldn't be able to advise someone, say in Minnesota, whether their contract meets Minnesota law. I would be able to look at something and say, this seems out of the ordinary in a normal landlord-tenant situation. That I could say. So,
Okay.
I wouldn't be able to give generic advice across the world, but I could say, based on my experience with landlord-tenant law, that seems strange. You might want to talk to an attorney in your state, your country, that type of thing. I had no idea we were going to have people attending from all over, literally all over the world.
All over the world, right? So because I personally have lived under the radar, I had to create my own documents. I just grabbed stuff off the internet. So, things from my past and, hoped and prayed it all would it worked out. And it did. I was also told to leave. I got the 30-day notice. We had to pack up our tiny home. By the way, anyone parking on a field, be aware of what time of season you're parking on a field, because if you get told to leave and you're in the middle of winter, you might have some mud reality, get some professionals involved, because it literally was, trucks getting sunk and the whole thing story. In addition to that, we had a builder go bust on us. So there was a number of questions around what if my tiny home builder doesn't deliver my home on time? Can I have them reduce their money? Well, you probably want to have that in the front end conversation, right? Have all your negotiations in the front end. Mm-hmm. I joke and I put it in here. I'm like, if I ever get a home built again, I'll have 5 payments and I'll live in their parking lot. Just kidding, not really. But yeah, it's so important, you guys, to get the conversations with the builders, have your payment plans over time. What certifications they're certifying your home to, also super important.
Yeah. And the big thing I think that gets a miscue in a lot of the contracts, the payments are on a time basis, but they aren't tied into completion dates. And I think it should be payment with completion, because, me paying quarterly taxes is one thing, but me paying quarterly payments to a builder, but not having my bathroom done and my flooring done.
True.
So that's a different scenario.
And if your builder is getting certified, they're taking images and pictures of that whole build. You should be easily, when I work with Pacific West, we have a whole app. You're able to see your images, and video as that home is being built. So if that's not happening, look elsewhere. The other one you just mentioned, the time payments, there's times where they're doing their framing. There's times when they're doing their interior, they're easy parts along the way. And I get it. Not everyone knows, because they've never had a home built. A lot of us coming into this world have never even thought about getting a custom home built. And now you're designing one not only on wheels, but also compressed.
Right.
Yeah. Right. So super important to know the stages. Do you recommend, wow, this industry really needs a lot of support, because there's a lot of people well, where do I go for a model or I know you're a lawyer there in Florida, but is that something that you'd be willing to teach more of an expanded course on these topics?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. It's the kind of stuff that people get hurt by, not having your contract. And then when it comes to my friend will let me live on their land. And I was starting to think, well, what if we are actually going to rent our tiny home to be on someone else's property? So not only are we going to rent it to someone else, but also someone else's property. I was like, what if something goes bad between these people and we're over here and we can get on that property? I was like, oh my, I may not want to rent my home.
Yeah. One thing I can tell you as a landlord-tenant attorney, regardless of which side I'm on, you hear some of the facts that no one would believe. No one. So, you start out with this great relationship, and then one thing happens, someone gets sick, or, someone who owns the land passes away, and their children say, no way are you staying here anymore. That's a reality that can happen very easily. So
how do we get in touch with you? I have your email, but I didn't want to blast it out to everyone. Is that a place to reach you? What's the...
Yes, that's perfect. And I'm on LinkedIn as well. So thanks for the opportunity.
Is it just your email? Is that a good place, or is there another?
Yeah, probably my email is
Okay,
good.
great. I'm dropping it in the comments, you guys, because, work with her. Once again, she's not going to be able to give you full, legal advice on your specific area unless you're in Florida, right?
Correct. And I did have some people at the cocktail who were in Florida, believe it or not.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jody. I really appreciate it. We've got coming up next. Jason and Zach are coming up next. So because they're coming up next, if anyone has any major questions, we're not going into another speaker, but I think we are getting the big thank you, Jody, so much for your time.
Thank you so much. Enjoyed it.
If you guys want Jody, let us know. Give us the comments in the feed.